Hi everyone, welcome to what I read in March. This month I read 5 books, which, if you've been keeping track, is a little bit less than my January and February numbers, which is okay. I love it, 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 I love it. Corny. I want to apologize, because this video isn't gonna be as good as other videos because I haven't prepared for it at all. I'm going off the top of my head, talking about 5 books that I read in the month of March. So let's start with one I bought at the Fraser Valley Regional Library. It's called Undiscovered by Gabriella Wiener. This book is great. It's kind of auto-fiction, is that what it's called? It blurs the line of fiction and nonfiction really fascinatingly and really well. It's about a queer, polyamorous Peruvian woman living in France and reckoning with her ancestors' tumultuous colonial past. So her great-grandfather is a man named Charles Wiener, where she gets her last name. So Charles Wiener, I'm gonna say, is a real person who almost discovered Machu Picchu. He didn't. He instead just stole a bunch of Peruvian artifacts for France. And while he was in Peru, he had a baby with a Peruvian woman who is Gabriella's great-grandmother. It talks a lot about decolonizing the self. It goes a lot into sex, decolonizing sex, cis heteronormativity, and it's really fascinating. It also touches on ideas of where do we fit into this? As the ancestors of the colonialists, of the settlers, where do we fit into this as their descendants? Both as their descendants and the descendants of the oppressed peoples whose land they colonized. So it's really, really fascinating read. Great read. I gave it, I think, 4.25 stars. Next up we have Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. I saw the movie for this years ago, so I don't really have a great memory of it, but as someone who's spent time in a psych ward, though not as a woman in the 60s, which is uncomprehensibly worse, I felt it a lot. It was very relatable in certain ways, but also really insightful into the institutionalization of people. Susanna Kaysen's story, if you're unaware, she was institutionalized after a 20-minute appointment with a doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever the terminology was, in 1967. And 17 years old? 18, sorry. And she was in the same hospital as Sylvia Plath, Ray Charles, for example. So it's a memoir that is really, really well written, like incredibly written. Immediately after reading it, I added Susanna Kaysen's other books to my to-read list because it was brilliant. Also, for the time in which it was written, a surprisingly poignant and timeless critique of psychology and psychiatry as institutions, and of course of institutionalization as a larger construct. It is just brilliant. Brilliant. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it a lot. Next up we have Bones and All by Camille DeAngelis. The film adaptation directed by Luca Guadagnino is a favorite of mine. I love it very much. I rewatch it fairly often. So I was so excited when I found the book at Winners. Awesome, for like $8. Ridiculous. This book has a few really interesting differences to the film. For example, this isn't a spoiler, but Marin's mother in the film is the eater, is the person who is institutionalized. Check it out. And Marin's father in the film stays with her until she's 15, 16 and then leaves her. Now in the book, it's the opposite. So it's Marin's mother who cares for her and then leaves her. Her father is the one who's institutionalized. The film, I feel, follows more closely on Lee and Marin's relationship, how that develops. The book is centered around Marin, and Lee is kind of in her orbit. And of course we explore their relationship as two eaters, but it's always Marin at the core. I think the book has a lot of scenes that should have been in the movie that are much better. As much as I love the movie, I prefer the book, but it's weird. I also didn't love the book, but I liked its telling of Marin's story better. Sully is a much more interesting character in the book, I think, and some of those connections, if you've read the book. I also think the ending of the book wasn't great, and I think maybe there's an area where Guadagnino's adaptation is kind of superior. I think in the movie there are pieces missing as well, like when Marin kind of finds Lee again after they've split up, following when Marin finds her mother in the institution. It makes a lot more sense in the book. It's the classic book film adaptation debate. Of course the book, there's more detail, there's more room for it. Of course there's going to be more, of course it's going to be more fleshed out. And while I still think Bones and All is a 5-star film, for me at least, which is all that matters to me, I gave Bones and All as a novel 4 stars. Because I think there's parts that could have been improved on, parts that could have been more clear, parts that could have been more fleshed out, but it's still really fun to read, and I would recommend it. Next up, I read Crier's War. This was recommended to me by a lesbian friend of mine. It's a fantasy novel, which I don't read a lot of. It's decently sized. I had a little bit of big book anxiety going into it. It's 420 odd pages.
Smoke weed every day.
Sorry. I am gonna read it. I'm gonna read the synopsis because me explaining this just off the top of my head would be a mess. After the War of Kinds, the Autome, designed to be the playthings of royals, usurped the estates of their owners and bent the human race to their will. Now, the names in this book, I had a conversation with my friend about how do we pronounce them. I don't know. I'm just gonna go for it. Now, HEYYYY, a human servant rising in the ranks at the sovereign's house, dreams of avenging the death of her family by killing the sovereign's daughter, Lady Crier. Crier, who was made to be beautiful, flawless, and to succeed her father. Crier had been preparing to do just that before she was betrothed by Sire Kinnock. Girl. Before she discovered her father isn't as benevolent as she thought, before she met HEYYYY. So, I have some issues with the politics of this book, but I think a lot of them just serve as placeholders and as metaphor for compulsory heterosexuality. I was under the impression, not by anyone specifically's doing, by the book, if anything, just the synopsis, that this was going to be more of a romance fantasy novel. There wasn't much romance. There was the push and pull of two characters on, you know, the classic fantasy dichotomy of, at least I think, I don't read that much fantasy, as I said, of, like, top, upper echelon, like, royal, and then, like, her servant, her handmaiden at points in the book, which is a classic tale, which I love, but there wasn't that much romance. They kissed once. And I wish there was more. I wish they got more into that. There is a second book, which maybe there's more in that, which I'm gonna read, but I was left wanting more, which I guess is the point of the first book in a series, but I was left wanting more in specific parts. A fun fantasy read. It was queer. I like that the queerness of the characters is something that they both kind of stepped into naturally without questioning whether it was wrong, without other characters seeing it or perceiving it and questioning it as moral or as valid. I do have one issue, though. that's overarching all of this. The anime, things that were made by humans, that took over the humans. What is the point for them? I get the point of the humans wanting little playthings that are human-like, but for the anime, they don't really feel love. They don't have connections to family in the same way. They're not big into art, rituals, traditions, anything really. What they seem to be into is power, which also humans are into, but it's not the only thing they're into, and it's in different ways. For me, I'm into power in the way that, like, I want power distributed equally through the means of production, through, like, socially. That's the power I'm interested in. The anime are not interested in that. They're interested in being better than the humans, which they are because they're made to be flawless, but they're interested in land and I don't really know. So that's my critique of the anime. I don't really get, like, if you're an anime, what are you doing it for? What are you serving the king for? But I gave it 3.75, 3.5 stars, somewhere in that range. And I'd recommend it if you want, like, a fun fantasy, an accessible fantasy queer read. It's fun. The last book I read this month is How to Kill Your Family by Bella Mackie. I wanted to read this for a while. Of course, the, like, clickbaity title got me immediately, but it essentially follows I just finished reading it like 20 minutes ago. It follows Grace, who was raised by a single mother all her life and was told by her single mother that she is the daughter of this, like, billionaire rich guy, Simon Artemis. So her mother loved Simon, even though they had, like, a fling. That sounded so judgmental to Grace's mother, and I don't mean that. Simon got her pregnant, abandoned her, didn't want anything to do with her, moved on, whatever. So Grace, all her life, has wanted revenge, and her revenge is killing everyone in that family, because that family ruined her life, ruined her mother's life. They were poor, blah blah blah, yada yada yada. So Grace goes through her plan of killing off everyone in the family line. She kills Simon's parents, she kills Simon's nephew, she kills Simon's brother, she kills Simon's wife, and she kills Simon's daughter. Okay, I'm not gonna just summarize the plot, but this explores themes of class in the UK in, I kind of think, surface level ways. There's one part about how Donald Trump is orange, and I went, oh brother, are we still doing that? And I know, like, the book wasn't written yesterday, like, it's not, but still, it was tacky. There's a lot of, like, girl boss feminism tackiness in it. Another thing is, none of the characters were likable. And I get that Grace is kind of this anti-hero. She complains a lot about a lot of things, but that's not her fault. She was raised in a really sticky situation. Her mother died when she was very young, and she's had this, like, revenge plot on her mind ever since. But I find myself rooting for her, but I also am like, you don't have to be an asshole about all of it, like, about everything you do. Like, her comments on what people are doing and stuff just rub me the wrong way sometimes, which is fine. She's, like, an unlikable anti-hero, but also, like, there wasn't really anyone I was consciously rooting for throughout the story. The end, the twist, I wasn't a huge fan of. So, and I haven't thought about what I want to rate it yet. And ratings don't matter, so it doesn't really matter. But I'm thinking, like, 3 stars, maybe. Okay, I'm gonna go now. I have plans to watch Love Lies Bleeding. Go, Kristen Stewart. Go, Kristen Stewart. Go, Kristen Stewart. Go,